Let's talk about the numbers, because this is where the hidden layer becomes visible. If each incoming missile requires multiple interceptors for a high-confidence interception, and each interceptor carries a significant cost, then every engagement becomes expensive very quickly. Now multiply that across 3 separate strikes, each requiring dozens of responses, and you're looking at a level of resource consumption that adds up faster than most people realize. But here's what nobody is explaining clearly. The cost isn't just financial, it's logistical, it's operational. It's about how quickly those resources can be replaced, and whether they can be replaced at all within the time frame of continued escalation. Because once resources drop below a certain threshold, the strategy changes. You can't respond to everything the same way anymore. You have to prioritize, and prioritization means accepting risk. Now consider the psychological side of this. Imagine being in one of those regions. It's the middle of the night. You hear the first alert, you move to safety. Before you've even processed what just happened, another alert sounds in a completely different area. Then another. There's no pattern, no clear end. Just a rapid sequence that creates a sense of unpredictability. And unpredictability is powerful, because it removes the ability to prepare. This is where the midpoint hits, and where everything shifts from what happened to what this means. Because hitting 3 strategic bases in 2 hours isn't just about damage, it's about proving something. Proving that multiple high-value targets can be engaged in rapid succession without giving the system time to adapt. And once that capability is demonstrated, it changes future expectations. Because now the question isn't whether it can happen again, it's how often, and how quickly the interval between strikes can shrink even further. This is where the escalation becomes exponential, because if 3 strikes in 2 hours can stretch the system, what happens with 5, with 7, with continuous cycles over longer periods? At what point does the system move from controlled response to constant strain? And this is where the math becomes unavoidable. Let's say each strike required 30 to 50 interceptors. Multiply that across 3 engagements, and you're looking at potentially 100 to 150 interceptors used in a very short time frame. Now consider how long it takes to replenish that inventory. Not hours, not days, sometimes weeks or months. That gap matters. Because if the rate of usage exceeds the rate of replenishment, the system moves toward depletion. And depletion changes everything. Now let's zoom out even further. Because this isn't just about 3 bases, it's about the structure behind the strikes, the timing, the sequencing, the decision to compress multiple high-value engagements into a narrow window. That's not random. That's strategic design aimed at exploiting one specific limitation: finite capacity. You can build the most advanced defense system in the world. You can achieve high interception rates. You can deploy multiple layers of protection. But none of that changes one fundamental reality: resources are limited. And once those limits are approached, every decision becomes more difficult. Now imagine this pattern continuing over several days. Not just 3 strikes, but repeated sequences, inventory dropping, response efficiency declining, pressure increasing. At what point does the system begin to prioritize certain areas over others? And what happens to the areas that aren't prioritized? This is the part that most people aren't asking, because the focus remains on immediate outcomes: what was hit, what was intercepted. But the long-term implications tell a different story. One where sustained pressure forces strategic trade-offs that wouldn't be considered under normal conditions. And this brings us to the endgame, because what we're seeing here isn't just an isolated event, it's a shift in how these engagements are structured. Faster, more compressed, more demanding on the system's ability to respond continuously without degradation. And degradation doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually. A slight delay here, a slightly higher cost there, a slightly lower margin of safety with each subsequent engagement, until eventually those small changes add up to something significant. By the end of those 2 hours, the immediate impacts had already been assessed, damage reports compiled, responses executed. But beneath all of that, something else had changed. At exactly 1:18 a.m., the situation changed in a way nobody expected, and within the next 2 hours, 3 separate strategic bases were hit in rapid succession. No warning, no pause, no time to recalibrate. This wasn't a single strike, and it wasn't random. It was a sequence, precise, timed, and layered in a way that suggests something far more calculated than what's being publicly discussed. Because while early reports focused on impacts and responses, the real story isn't just where the missiles landed, it's how quickly everything unfolded and what that speed reveals about what's coming next. Before we break down those 2 hours, you need to understand something most coverage isn't explaining. This wasn't just about hitting targets, it was about compressing time. Because when multiple high-value locations are struck within such a narrow window, the advantage shifts. Decision-makers don't have time to analyze, systems don't have time to reset, and every second lost becomes part of the strategy itself. That's the part nobody is emphasizing, and once you see it, the entire situation looks very different. The first impact came just after 1 a.m. A strategic installation, high value, heavily monitored, and supposedly well protected. Initial alerts triggered immediately, defense systems activated, and within seconds, interceptors were already in the air. On the surface, it looked like a standard engagement. Response time was fast. Coverage appeared strong. But here's what nobody is telling you. That first strike wasn't meant to overwhelm defenses. It was meant to activate them. Because once a system is active, it begins consuming resources. Interceptors get deployed. Radar systems stay locked. Personnel shift into continuous response mode. And from that moment on, everything becomes reactive instead of predictive. Then came the second strike. Just 47 minutes later, before the first engagement had fully stabilized, another wave targeted a completely different location. Not adjacent, not overlapping, separate. Which means resources couldn't simply shift, they had to be divided. And this is where things start to escalate, because dividing defensive coverage introduces gaps. Not visible gaps, not obvious ones, but operational gaps that reduce efficiency. This is where things change. Now, instead of one coordinated response, there are multiple simultaneous responses, each requiring its own interceptors, its own tracking systems, its own decision chain. And when you stretch a system across multiple high-priority zones, you're no longer operating at full strength in any one place. But here's what makes this more concerning. The second strike wasn't just timed closely, it was timed deliberately. It arrived before full assessment of the first strike could be completed, which means decision-makers were forced to act without complete information, and acting without complete information increases the likelihood of overcompensation. More interceptors launched than necessary, more redundancy built into each engagement, more resources consumed per threat. And then, before either situation could fully stabilize, the third strike hit. 2 hours. 3 strategic bases, and no recovery window in between. This is the part that should worry you, because by the time the third strike landed, the system wasn't operating under normal conditions anymore. It was under continuous stress. Multiple engagements still active. Inventory already reduced. Decision fatigue beginning to set in. And when all of those factors combine, even the most advanced systems start to show strain. Now imagine this from inside the system. Alerts overlapping, incoming trajectories crossing different sectors, communication channels active across multiple regions at once. Every decision has to be made faster than usual, with less certainty than usual. And every mistake, no matter how small, has a larger impact than it would under normal conditions. And this is where the real story begins. Because what happened in those 2 hours wasn't just a series of impacts. It was a demonstration of how quickly a coordinated sequence can force a defensive network into a reactive state, where efficiency drops and consumption rises. The perception of control. Because once multiple strategic locations can be hit in rapid succession, the idea of complete coverage starts to feel less certain. Not gone, but challenged. And that challenge introduces a new variable into everything that comes next. Because now, every future engagement isn't just about stopping what's incoming, it's about managing what's left. And that's a very different kind of problem. So the real question isn't what happened during those 2 hours. The real question is what those 2 hours revealed, because if 3 strikes were enough to create this level of strain, what happens when the next sequence isn't just 3? And more importantly, what happens when there's no gap between them at all?